You've been repenting for things that were never actually sins. Not just once, you've been doing it for months, maybe years, getting smaller, getting quieter, asking God what you did wrong as if the answer to the rejection was somewhere inside your own failure. Pause, drop tone quieter. But what if you've been reading the story backwards this whole time? There's a version of you still sitting in the parking lot of that church, or wherever the final moment actually was, replaying the accusations, the meeting where they pulled you aside, the sermon that felt aimed directly at you, the silence from people you believed were family, and underneath all of that, a question you haven't let yourself ask out loud. What if I wasn't rejected because I failed them, but because I reminded them of something they could not afford to see? Have you ever noticed that the people with the most genuine Christ-like character are almost always the first ones a controlling church removes? If you've been walking through church hurt, through the confusion of spiritual abuse recovery, through the fog of wondering what you did to deserve this, that question matters more than most people realize. Because by the end of this, you will understand exactly why that happens, and more importantly, you will understand what God has actually been saying about you through it. Here's the cost of missing this. Every day you carry false guilt from church hurt is another day you treat your God-given gifts as liabilities. You dim your discernment, you apologize for your honesty, you shrink the very things God designed you to use. And the tragedy isn't only the wound itself, the tragedy is what the wound silences. Let me paint something for you. Imagine a room that has been kept deliberately dark for years. The people inside have organized their entire system around that darkness, the way they interpret scripture, the way they measure worth, the way authority flows from the top down without question. And then you walk in, not to disrupt anything, not with rebellion or pride, just carrying the light you were born with. Your empathy, the kind that notices when someone is suffering before they ever say a word. Your honesty, the kind that asks hard questions from a posture of genuine love, not accusation. Your fruit, the actual measurable spirit-produced fruit of a life that walks closely with God. And here is what happens next, and this is the part that almost no one explains in conversations about spiritual abuse recovery. The darkness does not adapt to your light. It attacks it. Narcissistic church leaders and the systems they build around themselves operate on a very specific psychological requirement. They need a controlled narrative. A version of reality where they are always the anointed authority, the interpreter of God's will, the ones who determine who is walking in truth and who is out of order. But a person with genuine spiritual integrity is extraordinarily dangerous to that environment, not because they're rebellious, not because they've walked into the room with an agenda, but because Christ-like character, real compassion, authentic truth-telling, the kind of love that doesn't shift based on who's watching, acts like a mirror. And a system built on darkness cannot survive its own reflection. So the system does what darkness always does when a mirror appears that it cannot control. It throws a lampshade over it. They call your discernment divisiveness. They call your honest questions a spirit of rebellion. They call your healthy limits pride and self-will. They call your grief over what you witnessed a bitter, unforgiving heart. And if the lampshade isn't enough, if your light keeps showing through the cover, eventually they remove you, and then they tell the room you left on your own, or that you walked into darkness, or that God removed his hand from your life. The shame they handed you on the way out the door, that wasn't a verdict. That was a cover-up. I know that might be difficult to receive fully. Because you loved these people, this was your community. They used the language of scripture, of covenant, of spiritual family, language you had come to associate with God himself. So when they named you as the problem, some part of you accepted it as spiritual authority, because you are someone who takes God seriously. And that is exactly what made you vulnerable to it. Here is the reversal I need you to hold for a moment. In 1 Samuel 16, God sends the prophet Samuel to anoint the next king of Israel. Samuel walks through the candidates, all the ones the established system would have elevated, impressive by every visible measure. And God stops him. Do not look at his appearance or his height, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The one God had already chosen was out in the field, doing unglamorous work, not even considered worthy of being called to the initial gathering. What the religious system had been using as disqualification, the smallness, the obscurity, the not fitting the mold, was actually the marker God recognized. Your exclusion from their system is not evidence against your calling. It may be the clearest evidence for it. But here is what false guilt does in the aftermath of church hurt, and this is where it gets quietly destructive. It doesn't only make you doubt what they did to you. It makes you doubt the gifts themselves. You stop trusting your own discernment because the last time you voiced it, someone called it pride. You stop asking questions out loud because the last time you did, you were labeled divisive. You stop leading with vulnerability because the last time you loved that openly, it was used against you. Healing from shame after spiritual abuse isn't only about processing the rejection. It's about recovering the specific gifts that their language of accusation was designed to bury. Because the thing they punished you for was not the defect they named it. It was the threat they experienced. And maybe you're sitting with this right now and something in you recognizes this as true, but there's a heaviness underneath the recognition. Because even understanding this intellectually doesn't always silence the voice. You still flinch when someone asks you to step into spiritual leadership. You still shrink when your perception turns out to be right. You still hear their words in the quiet, divisive, prideful, not submitted, bitter, and some part of you whispers, "What if they were right about me?" That's the lampshade. Still on. Installed by people who could not afford your clarity. Let me give you the actual removal, not from the church, from the lies they left inside you when they closed that door. There are 3 specific lies that toxic church systems place on the people they expel. They are almost always identical because they are precision targeted at the exact qualities that made that person a mirror the system couldn't survive. The first lie, your spiritual gifts are just ego dressed up in God's language. What God actually says you are called, that is precisely why it cost them so much to suppress you. The second lie, you caused division because you couldn't submit to authority. What God actually says, you refuse to make peace with something that was quietly destroying people. That is not a character defect. That is Christlike courage wearing the only face it could. The third lie, the fact that you left or were removed, proved you were never truly committed. What God actually says, you stayed long enough to learn the difference between God and someone wearing his name, and when the moment came, you chose God. These are not small adjustments to how you see the past. These are identity-level reversals. And your heart has been living in the wrong version of that story for far too long. Here is what I want you to actually do, and this is the mirrored truth exercise. Take the specific labels they placed on you when you were removed, shamed, or dismissed. Write them down, the exact words they used for your character, the accusations, the spiritual language they wrapped around what they were doing. Now hold each one up not to their voice, but to the Spirit's own fruit in Galatians 5. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Ask one question for each label. Does this word contradict the fruit, or does it describe it? Because healing from church hurt at its deepest level is not only emotional recovery. It is definitional recovery. They tried to redefine you, but God already defined you. Psalm 139 says you were woven together intentionally, not assembled by accident. John 15 says you were chosen not by performance, but by the Father's own purpose. Isaiah 43 says you are called by name. The mirror they hated was the accurate one. The one they held up to diminish you was constructed from their own unresolved darkness. You don't heal from church hurt by becoming suspicious of everything spiritual. You heal by recovering the sound of what God's voice actually feels like in your body, versus the echo of someone who was afraid of your light. And here is the truth about light that darkness has never once managed to change in all of human history. Covering a lamp does not put it out. It only makes the room darker. Your light is still lit. It was never the problem. The world God is calling you into needs exactly the kind of person they tried to convince you to stop being. That person is you. Go be them.